Hi everybody, Joe here, Psychedelics today. Hope you're doing well. Today on the show, Britta Love and I talk about all sorts of very helpful stuff, I think. Currently, we're going under a period of self-reflection, I guess, in the psychedelic world, and a lot of sex politics things have been coming up, gender inequality, material race inequality. So a lot of things are coming to light lately, and people are looking at them really seriously. I invited Britta on the show after helping edit the recent Dismantling the Patriarchy video series, and Britta had some excellent things to say on there, and I wanted her to come on to talk about her experience of being a woman in psychedelics and share any of her wisdom that she could on the show, and it was great. I hope I was able to showcase the best of her thinking on this stuff, but I imagine, as we discuss in the show, that this is really a long conversation that all of us need to have. This is not something we're going to sort out in a week or two. This is this whole power dynamics, how to deal with criminals, I guess people who did bad things to other people, all that stuff. We have to figure out what the best way forward is here. Like, it's one thing, yes, we found out some things, but it's another thing to handle it appropriately. Do you just throw that person's name out and kind of talk a lot of negativity, or do you bring it to a court, or what do you do? Like, what is the method forward? And Britta and I get into some great stuff there, and thank you again, Britta, for being willing to share your insight and wisdom on this stuff. And listeners, if you really enjoy what you hear, just let us know. We'd love to know if you want to hear more about this. I think people like Catherine McLean, who are working really hard on this issue, are definitely interested in more material like this. So if that's of interest to you, let us know. Psychedelics Today, email@gmail.com. Again, today's interviewee is Britta Love. No Kyle on this episode, so sorry again, but yeah, real soon. Kyle and I are heading to Jamaica in a few days, so I'm sure you're going to be hearing from us down there together. Anyway, thanks everybody for listening, and talk later. Bye. If you want to support the show with some small, regular donations, we have a Patreon site, patreon.com/psychedelics today, and you can give us a small monthly donation or donations by show. So check that out. You can give as little as $1 a month if you want to just help us out a little bit, pay the bills and keep the lights on, and just improving the quality of the show. In the near future, I think we need to buy some new microphones, and I think Kyle and I might need some new PCs to keep the editing going. So if you want to support us there, that would be lovely. Patreon.com/psychedelics today. Psychedelics Today has partnered with Daniel McQueen over at Medicinal Mindfulness on this new and very exciting project you've heard about on our show a bunch and maybe elsewhere, extended state DMT research. So the concept is to use a IV pump and keep a steady blood concentration of DMT in the bloodstream for an undetermined amount of time. Rick Strassman, I think, responded that he would like to try it the first time for a few weeks, or something silly like that, maybe just a week. But, I think the initial phases of the study will be maybe 20 minutes, 10 minutes, just to extend that blood concentration peak of DMT that you would get from a freebase or an insufflated dose of DMT. And it's more from a psychonaut perspective, which is interesting. It's not just for medical research, it's for our community. We want to know what happens, and you have an opportunity to participate. We have on our Teachable platform over at psychedelicstoday.teachable.com a class for sale called the DMTX Psychonaut Training, and it is the first step. If you want to be a candidate for this, you might have to really work. It's kind of like an astronaut program, like NASA grade kind of selection for participants. So check that out. Teachable is hosting our class, psychedelicstoday.teachable.com. Kyle and Daniel McQueen ran a multi-week class, and you can get the bulk of it there. And yeah, the class proceeds go to support the Psychonaut training and getting funding enough to push this through to make it legal to do in the States. So yeah, again, check that out, psychedelicstoday.teachable.com, and see if you want to pick up that class, DMTX Psychonaut Training. Finally here, if you want to support the show but can't afford to buy a t-shirt or a mug from our shop, feel free to just leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Facebook, anywhere really, Google. Tell your friends, share your favorite episodes with them, or maybe ask your significant other or parents for a seat to our class, Navigating Psychedelics, so you can keep yourself safe. So again, yeah, we'd love to have you tell your friends about the show or just plug us on your socials. Thanks again for listening and enjoy the show. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today on the show, we have Britta Love, who is a writer and somatic sex educator in New York. Britta, welcome to the show. I think there were some other things you were focusing on as well in your work.
Well, yeah, I guess that what I bring to the psychedelic patriarchy conversation that I know we want to really continue here was sort of the overlap of sexuality and psychedelics. And my work is in the field of consciousness and embodiment studies, looking at the overlap and the complementary aspects of using conscious sexuality and the conscious use of psychedelics.
Yeah, that's a really powerful combination. So we kind of got connected because of this recent event that Catherine McLean helped coordinate with a few others called, what was it called? Dismantling the Psychedelic Patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know other people who helped coordinate that? Were there other names?
Catherine McLean was really organizing it with Dimitri Mugianis, and then they got the rest of us involved. So it was a great panel. Actually, we had Lily flying all the way in from the other side of the world. So it was pretty amazing to get people together, and also on Skype coming in from across the country to get that conversation going. It felt like the real intersection of a lot of perspectives.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I had the opportunity to edit the video, so I got to jump in the deep end with the conversation, like maybe 2 months before it was aired, maybe. So it was very interesting, and had some back channel kind of conversations with folks involved there, and learned quite a bit. So thank you for participating in that.
Sure.
Were there any big takeaways for you from that panel that you'd want to share?
Oh, I mean, there were a few things. I mean, the at the outset, it felt like what a huge topic, right? To have this one sort of hour and a half, 2 hour event to address patriarchy as it manifests in the psychedelic community. And I feel like a large portion of the time was spent really just giving a platform for in this case women to share their stories of sexual abuse and harassment in the community. And that felt so important. And it felt like we could have probably had a series of events just for that, for the kind of catharsis and the, opening those conversations. And then there's also these deeper ways that patriarchy affects the way that we approach most things in life, living in this particular culture, and the way that it affects the way we go about things in the psychedelic community, which I feel like we started just touching on at the end of the discussion, and which could be something that we got together to talk about monthly for the next 10 years, and probably didn't finish that conversation. There's some huge things that were coming up for people. So one big takeaway was just that, wow, there's so much depth here, and there's been so little space for these conversations so far, and how great that we were starting that. And then a personal takeaway for me was feeling like I came there with a story of something that I had witnessed and experienced in my psychedelic journeys, and found it myself so deer in the headlights sharing that story. And it really impressed upon me how difficult it is to come out in community with stories like that. It wasn't even something that had happened personally to me. And that really kind of something I maybe always knew intellectually, but maybe in a more embodied way, made me realize how important it is that when someone steps up to share these stories, as we're seeing more and more in our community right now, that it's really important that we take them at face value and listen and hold space for that, because it's really not an easy thing to do, even if you do a lot of public speaking, which I kind of do at this point. So those are just two immediate things that hit me from that discussion.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very interesting thing. I learned so much. It's interesting because it's really hard. I've been watching social media, and I'm sure you have too, about a lot of
Mm.
these conversations that are going on, and they online they just seem really superficial, and like a lot of folks are missing a lot of points because there's a substantial amount that isn't really visible, I guess, when we're trying to discuss these things, and just the larger conversation is not as deep as it needs to be. Like you said, 10 years and once a month, and you're kind of just scratching the surface. And I kind of agree there. And
Yeah.
on one hand, it really sucks that we're falling victim to this. On the other, like what better community to be able to handle this and be an example for all of the other communities that are also suffering. Like the amount of consciousness we can bring is incredible.
That's the opportunity if we choose to take it, and I think that it's a really big moment for the psychedelic community because there's really I feel like it's like crossroads, there's the path that I think I was on even up until a few years ago when I was kind of getting into some of the more critical analysis in my thesis, where it was just like these psychedelics are just so beautiful. They help us evolve our consciousness. We can use them to heal the world, and it's spirituality, and it's so separate from politics. And I don't want to hear about all these other things that out in the world. They'll be fixed if we can all just get, trip and really get into these elevated states. And then there's the reality that numerous oppressive systems have been upheld by the use of these substances for millennia. So it's not inherent, there's nothing inherent to, there's very patriarchal systems organizing the use of a lot of these plants in traditional cultures right now. So that's not a given. But the tools are so powerful that if we chose to use maybe a little bit of this analysis that we have right now politically in the West in more progressive circles and chose to use that to inform the spiritual work that we do individually and in a community, then I think we do have the opportunity to lead as a community. But I think we can't afford to have our head in the sand anymore or to sort of want to separate out what's happening politically from what we're doing in our healing and psychonautic explorations.
Right. Complex. And we need to be really careful and talk this out at length.
Mhm.
Yeah. Otherwise, we fall victim to our own mistakes, like spiritual bypass and just,
Exactly. And it's something that I think we like to have everything really neatly tied up back again because we like to feel that we've got a community that's healthy and this feels so good and we're so counter to this culture that's so messed up. And we have to be okay with the fact that as we get confronted by the internalized racism and patriarchy and privilege that our society that our psychedelic subculture carries, that it's going to be a little messy for a while and that we're all going to have to feel uncomfortable at times. That's part of it. And I guess in some of my anti-racist work, whenever I start to feel uncomfortable, I think, oh well, that's nothing, right, compared to how uncomfortable it must be to live in a society that's this oppressive. And if we all take on a little bit of that attitude and sort of are like, well, maybe right now as a man hearing this is really uncomfortable, but maybe that's the surrender that I'm making into this to be able to evolve this discussion. It was like Dimitri said on the panel, something like giving up your privilege is like the ultimate psychedelic trip. It's like there's something about that surrender that's really deep, you know?
yeah, recognizing. So I'll use a male as an example because I read too many books by guys. But Robert Anton Wilson always had this idea about reality tunnels that he would talk about often, and it's this concept of you have your BS, your belief system, but what if we became more flexible and we could flip in between belief systems, and that way we become a lot more literate with reality. Because obviously, like Karl Marx's critique isn't 100% spot on, especially in this day and age. But you
Mhm.
know, but if you throw in 40 other worldviews, you become a little bit closer to something that looks a little bit like objective reality, but obviously isn't. But if you
Mhm.
catch my drift there, so like
Yeah.
understand where you're coming from. You did go
Hmm.
to Harvard. You do have $300,000 in your savings account. You're coming from a very different, and you have no police record in the last 5 generations. Like, that's a very different
Yeah,
spot to be in.
totally. Yeah, I think that's the place to begin, and I think that there's just so much that can unfold, that should unfold, that, if that in some ways so much of what we talk about, or I mean, a lot of us talk about when we think about the potential of psychedelics and transforming the world, like, actually the opportunity is right here. It's really a matter of, like, going into the bad trip, which means maybe seeing some of our heroes and our leaders in the community questioned, maybe having to deal with, like, personal discomfort about the actions we've taken, any number of things. I mean, that's any healing requires that kind of bad trip. So it kind of feels like that's the moment we're kind of at as a community, and it's interesting to see that trickle down into our little subculture, and to see who's sort of wants to sweep it under the carpet and who's ready to say, wow, I guess we really need to look at this now.
Huh. Yeah. So I'm hesitating to say this, but I'll say it anyway. But hey, Dimitri, just to bring up another guy, because for whatever reason, he's the only one coming to mind right now, had this point of, what kind of movement are we defending that can't handle this kind of stuff coming to light?
Yeah,
So it's paraphrasing,
exactly.
obviously. And all of you, if you have the time, please go check out that panel. It'll be linked in the show notes. But it was pretty
Hmm.
incredible. Like, yeah, do we really want to be party to something that lets this stuff go unchecked and unfiltered? I don't want to overstep bounds or anything, but could you give some examples of things that are, let's not out anybody or use names, but just like types of things that are happening?
Yeah, I mean, there are two examples that I think fit the narrative of what we were talking about a lot on the panel, which is pretty explicit sexual harassment and abuse. And I was on a trip in Africa to Gabon with a few other Westerners traveling with a very well known Ganga, to go through a traditional Bwiti initiation. And I met a young woman on the trip who had been on this remarkable path to really heal deep rooted depression, and had found iboga and had worked with this healer before, and had revelations about repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse that he was privy to, and part of her healing of which she was continuing supposedly by coming on this trip. And then I witnessed this incredibly predatory behavior, which I can't imagine what that was like to experience, to, if I had been there on my own rather than with a partner. And the healer that I went with, who'd already helped me with so much, started coming on to me and saying that the medicine told him that I was the one for him, and that he was divorcing his wife. Don't worry about that. And then I started getting cornered by his sister and his cousin, and told that this man's really in love with you. I mean, this is what was happening to this young woman. And it was so exploitative and abusive, and it was something that it took her, and we're still friends to this day, it took her years to really, like, fully process and come back from. And I think the reason that this story feels really important to me is that it's not as if no one's aware of this. There's a reputation around this man for this kind of behavior. I heard about it from the first time that I met anyone else who knew him. It's something that's like has been circling in the community for years. And yet it's really explained away as, oh, that's a cultural difference, or, well, but he's also a great healer. I know many people who run centers who use his name to justify their training and as ibogaine providers. And I think it's really a moment for looking at that. And I recently had a friend who told me, well, I finally witnessed that behavior, and now I'm really questioning things. And I heard rumors for years, but I just, like, it wasn't until I saw it. And I guess it's just, we're at a moment where we need to trust it when we hear it and react to it as a culture. And then the sort of counter example that I also want to mention, because I think it's easy to slip that into some kind of weird, like, racialized or exotified example of a traditional healer, and that's not happening in the psychedelic research community or the psychedelic, clinical psychedelic community, which it is that I recently met another young woman who told me a story of her whole family saving up, like 16 people put in each a different amount of money to send her to this very well respected, not fly by night ibogaine center in Mexico, and she was put on benzodiazepines post treatment and raped by a male nurse. And when she reported him, she was really strong armed in a very unpleasant way into signing a non disclosure agreement if she wanted any more medicine. And there was no real accountability process. And I just think this is not the kind of behavior that a respected institution for helping people who are often coming with very complex histories of intersecting drug abuse and sexual trauma and other experiences, to be treated that way. I was really dumbfounded, which I guess I shouldn't have been. And these are very egregious examples. And if we can't deal with those, then there's no way we can start dealing with the sort of microaggressions of everyday life as a woman in the psychedelic community or in any community under patriarchy.
Yeah, absolutely. There's huge issues we need to cover, and sometimes it seems impossible, right? Like I'm sure
Yeah.
coming from your position, it just seems like this is such a massive project that needs to be completed. Doesn't it look like a
Yeah.
decade to 2 decade long process or more?
Yeah,
Like,
definitely. It's not, you don't undo, like, 5,000 years of patriarchy or more, in a couple of years of news articles and some pink pussy hats. You don't That's not how it happens. It's going to take some time and some work and some commitment to the work. And I think that process is sort of like maybe in an unfolding where we started out with hearing the stories of the Harvey Weinsteins, and then we got kind of folded back and back to the Aziz Ansaris and the stories where people start going, oh, but is that borderline or is that this? And it's to me, it's pointing out something that is not just about individual behavior. Of course, individuals have to be held accountable for their behavior, but there's also a point of reckoning where we need to look at the way that masculinity is constructed in our culture and the messaging that all of us receive of every gender, man, woman, other, about how we perform sexuality and how we perform our gender. And so that process is something that psychedelics are uniquely positioned as tools to help us with if we choose to use them for that. Whether it's sort of, undoing internalized homophobia, finding ways to heal like guilt and shame around sexuality, which often drives really secretive and then sometimes abusive, sexual behaviors. Having a really good look at patterns in one's life in terms of how relationships with women turn out. There's so many ways in which psychedelics are so powerful if for exactly this use, except that they're only as useful as the container we create. And if the containers we create aren't encouraging us to do that kind of self-reflection, then that won't necessarily be what happens when we trip. So it feels like, how do we create containers where men feel comfortable questioning their performance of masculinity over their life and are and comfortable enough or feel safe enough to get vulnerable about places where they messed up? Because I don't think many men haven't, because masculinity in America is constructed in a really toxic way. And if you're just going about your normal life being influenced by the things around you in this culture, you probably have messed up with women. Like, I think that's really a reality of it. And it doesn't mean you've necessarily raped someone, but I'm saying that in terms of the way that we interact around gender and sexuality, it's just a big hot mess anyway. So it's like there's that spectrum from maybe slight dehumanization as a player to full on serial rapist, but that it's a spectrum, and everywhere along the spectrum needs to be looked at.
absolutely. I want to run this situation by you and just get your comments. Like, there is this gentleman in a community I was involved with in the past, somewhere that's not Colorado, and he was like a serial abuser, kind of wealthy, would take in young ladies to his house who were kind of like homeless or struggling. And he was one of these ringleaders in this kind of psychedelic musical community, with places outside of the US that they would use as like retreat/festival grounds. And he was just like this serial abuser, and the community knew about it, and they intervened
Mm.
here and there, but it never really stuck. It sounds like it just kept going. And some of the
Mhm.
behaviors were very, very bad. Definitely arrestable, like jail time kind of offenses. And um,
Wow.
but the elders of the community kind of stepped up and like tried to intervene and thought they did enough, but they really didn't, in my opinion.
Mhm.
I don't know. Any comments on that? Like,
Well, I mean, I think the most obvious comment is how common this stuff is, and that the it's very difficult because once you get to the point where, certain individuals become very aware of this happening, and maybe even a lot of individuals, maybe most of the people involved, I don't know what it takes for it to go from that awareness to actually this is not okay, so somehow this is going to stop. And I mean, I think the most obvious way would be non-participation and not engaging with or benefiting from having any kind of relationship with people like that. And
mm,
also, and I think also that's what we're starting to see in terms of having to name people. And I think that's an important thing to do when there is that level of like, serious crime taking place. And I mean, that's something that it's similar to my situation with the Bwiti Ganga that is very like well known for this and also yet is still being, used as some kind of example or legit like it bestows legitimacy upon so many providers of this medicine. And it's like that makes us complicit to do that. Like my husband and I were in Gabon to shoot a documentary with this healer, and we have beautiful footage of these Bwiti ceremonies. And I thought we could have made an incredible film, and it would have been an amazing documentary for my husband to have made. I would have loved to put that out in the community. But I just came back from that trip, and I just absolutely was not going to have anything to do with someone who could behave that way towards someone under his care. And I think that's the lines we have to draw. And I think it gets very difficult in a community that's kind of small, where there's limited opportunities for tutelage and for spaces to work out of, or for communities or parties to be at, to sort of like say that actually is just a hard line. But I think that's a boycott sort of thing is really important. Otherwise we're all complicit. But then in terms of how we heal as a community, I think with those, that's a that's a larger question of how we deal with things in terms of justice in those situations, and I'm not sure what the answer is to that. um
yeah, it's
I really
impossible
don't.
to just like one person, It's like
Yeah.
it's such a puzzle. It's going to take a lot of collective wisdom. Um,
Mhm.
one thing I like to raise here and there is that some people get a little testy around the diversity discussion too, and like in my opinion, diversity like I think is proportionally related to intelligence and resilience. So,
Mm.
I like this permaculture metaphor of like a diversity of plants and things in a system. And the more diverse the system is, the greater collective intelligence and resilience it has to catastrophic events and healing,
Absolutely.
right? Like, if you use like the soil as a metaphor, it's like you need a bunch of different plants here to help bring it back to some sort of equilibrium. And I think the same thing here. Like we need a lot of different types of people, and women, being hugely excluded is a big half of it. And then people of color,
Yeah.
another big half of it. And, there's
Yep.
huge portions of the population that I didn't even name there. so, so,
Yep.
how do you see anything optimistic on the horizon? Like people doing specific things that might really help, at least locally in certain areas?
I think the fact that, there's now been 2 psychedelics and race, or maybe even 3 public events in the last year or 2, in New York City anyway. There was the Brooklyn Psychedelic Society one last week, which was a very charged event, and then there were, 2 panels that Dimitri Moujanis put together. I think that was the first time I'd ever heard of anyone having those discussions. It's similar to this patriarchy panel, is the first event that I believe I've seen in the tri-state area in New York anyway, addressing the gender politics in the psychedelic community. And I think that until we have a lot of time in those discussions, we're not necessarily going to know what the next action is. And I think it's really important to like stay in that place of like not thinking that we've now come up with the agenda of how to fix something that's so deep and so structural. I think it really needs that kind of approach, kind of also a permaculture approach of like going now and specifically observing this and
Hmm.
looking at it and talking about it and seeing it over time and responding to it obviously as it's happening, in terms of not having people in positions of power who are serial abusers and things like that, but maybe not thinking that we can just like go out and find a way to get this all a lot more diverse and then we fix the problem, because it's really deeper than like, numbers or yeah, statistics like that.
Yeah, you're right. Like permaculture, like you'd think it's just about planting more plants, different types, but really, observation is one of the biggest things. Now that we're aware, now that more of us are aware of what's happening, it's kind of on all of us to just keep staying aware and sharing, and
Yeah,
communicating,
like
and
every time exactly, like every time we're in a space and it's psychedelic and all the panelists are men, or it's psychedelic and you don't see any people of color in the room, like, let's talk about that. Like, that's like naming the elephant is the first step. And like observing that and seeing where that changes and where it doesn't. And I think when you start seeing these, complaints emerging around, gender and sexual stuff in community, it becomes really important to hold space for that, because that's someone saying that we don't feel safe in the space, which is a big clue as to why maybe the diversity is not up to what everyone would like in their hearts it to be. So if people don't feel safe in a community, then that's going to be why people aren't showing up to events and aren't represented in these different worlds. So, and yet at the same time, I do wonder, and this is a question that I have with the bigger Me Too movement as well, because that conversation has been going on now for a chunk of time in the mainstream discourse. And we've named a lot of names, and we've thankfully had gotten a lot of people in positions of power over women out of those positions of power. But I just still feel like there's a depth of understanding around gender relations and sexuality that's missing. And I think a lot of it comes from living in a society that's very shaming and guilt oriented around sex, even though we're supposedly sexually liberated. So there's a really important, like, to me, a lot of times when I'm talking to cisgender men about, fear around, well, I don't even know how to pick up a woman anymore. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I'm afraid I'm going to get fired. I don't know. There's a lot of fear out there. And I think when I look at that, I think it's connected to the fact that we really don't have a healthy, pleasure oriented, like, relationship to sexuality to begin with. So it becomes stratified along gender lines often. It's not 100%, but like we're socially kind of given that programming so that women tend to not be as forward sexually and men feel like they need to be the aggressor. But if women could actually feel safe in a culture to express themselves and their sexuality in that kind of way and not be shamed for it, well, then maybe that would change those dynamics. So there's like a whole piece of this where I feel like we end up talking so much about, and we need to talk so much about, like, systemic, like, abuse of power and exploitation. And we also need to talk equally about constructing healthy models of sexuality, because otherwise it's sort of like two things happen. One is we're very focused on everything negative about sex, which is reinforcing some of our deepest fears around sexuality in society. And the other is that we don't actually give start creating places that are nurturing and healthy for that energy to go. And our sexual energy is such a fundamental life force. And when we haven't had it modeled in healthy ways for healthy forms of expression, then it comes out through the shadow. And that's what we see. That's why this sexual abuse, and it's not just men on women, it's every gender on every gender. It's like vastly less talked about when men experience sexual violence because there's an extra level of social shame around that. And so I also don't want to get so caught up in this like very binary narrative around sexual and gender politics, because it's really, I think, a reflection of our relationship to sex and power in our culture. And then because of patriarchy, we tend to see more cisgendered men in positions of power. So it gets played out along that dynamic, which is often man on fill in the blank, often women. And yet, I think if you switch that in a heartbeat and tomorrow somehow women were in positions of power, but we kept the same strange structures around sexuality and shame and guilt in our culture, I would venture to guess that women would be systemic sexual abusers. I really don't think there's something inherently bad about being a man or inherently more sexually aggressive or any of that. I think that we have a really powerful social constructs that are then played out along the lines of of the power dynamics that are stratified by gender, you know? So I just think that there's a lot to be looked at in terms of how we frame sexual violence in general. And I've been really inspired by my friend Jennifer Patterson, who collected an anthology of stories called Queering Sexual Violence that really looks at how many different forms of violence exist between different genders and in the queer community, and also the way in which often perpetrators are also victims and cycles of abuse, and really stop, to stop sort of this very binary perspective of perpetrator and victim, which doesn't actually necessarily lead anywhere that productive in the end.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think a really basic example is like Charlie Manson's childhood wasn't that great.
Right. Yeah.
These kind of bad situations tend to perpetuate.
Hmm.
We probably see it in all of our family lives. Yeah, it's not just this person is bad. It's this person had bad stuff and now does bad behavior. And
Right.
there's still a lot of ignorance, like everything you said there. There's so much for all of us to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an incredibly deep and long conversation that we're going to have to have. Are you seeing any other thought leaders you think are doing a good job here?
I mean, I'm really, like I said, Jennifer Patterson's doing amazing work around sexual violence. My friend Catherine McLean, who put that panel together, is really made herself into, like, she's put herself out there on the line to sort of say, I'm a place of sanctuary for people to come and for women to come specifically to talk about these issues, and I will support you. And I think that's incredible. I don't know that I've seen anything else that's really like started being built or is in existence. I know that a lot of people, I think most of us care about these issues, and we're finally kind of giving them some precedence in our like community as things that we really need to talk about. And I think amazing things can emerge from that. But I think one of the ideas with the panel was that to encourage people in other locations to put on their own versions of the event, or to screen the panel, to put on their own panel, to have their own group discussion, so that there was a way to sort of maybe start building little like communities all over the world who are starting to share their experiences of patriarchy in the community and start thinking up other, ways of addressing it and other models of being. I mean, one thing that we talked about on the panel a little bit at the end was that, even the idea of there being a healer or a guru or a, psychedelic researcher, and then the patient, the client, the, supplicant, whatever, that's a hierarchical model of, and that's actually something that emerged out of patriarchy. It's intimately connected to patriarchy. And there's something about that we've lost about the way that we don't need someone to be an expert. We're all our own best experts. And when we come together collectively in a group as equals and don't give our power away to someone else to heal us or to do something to us, then we actually create an opportunity for that to be a room full of healers, which we all are. And that is an incredible space. And I've been in spaces, not necessarily psychedelic spaces, but I've been to vision councils where a group of women got together for a weekend, and someone was kind of keeping track of time and saying, okay, well, we had these ideas, does everyone still want to do that? But generally speaking, it was just, there's no hierarchy, there was no leader, and we were sharing our experiences, our dreams, our visions connected to the theme of the weekend with a completely open flow. And what emerged from that, a totally sort of structureless, leaderless space, was some of the most like dense, rich, amazing material that I've experienced in any retreat kind of situation in my life, and there weren't even psychedelics involved. So I think there's so much power to creating spaces where individuals are empowered as contributors and as healers without having to divest themselves of that and give it to someone else. And and it's a powerful thing, like the guru phenomena. I just finished watching Wild Wild Country last week, which was that was a trip in itself if you haven't seen it. and
Not yet, but I know the story, and I really want to do a podcast on it.
Yeah, it's incredible. It was mind blowing. It was interesting. I mean, so many things emerged from it for me, but one thing was just how potent that was for that people who you could actually project so much onto a person and actually experience God or goddess or ecstasy, and you could project outwards and then receive back what you were projecting. And that's powerful magic. That's powerful sorcery, but ultimately it's your power. And when you hand it over and say it's their power, that's a really dangerous thing. And I think we do that in the psychedelic community a lot, whether it's to like a therapist or a traditional healer or shaman. I think that's something that we really need to look at as part of this patriarchy discussion, because that's not necessarily the way that humans have always been in relation to each other around these medicines.
Mm-hmm. In our Kyle's my co-host here with Psychedelics today. We were long-time holotropic breathwork people, and
Hmm.
we try our best to let everybody know it's the group. Like, we're just here kind of running everybody through the process that we know is good, but it's really you in this group that you're evolutionarily adapted to be in that is this healing agent in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think you were saying something about us being our own healers, and it's like this collective. Like, when you feel safe in a group, that's when you start healing in a lot of ways. One of the
exactly.
conditions in which is required to heal.
Yeah, and it's really important because I think there's a lot of our culture, kind of in general, American culture. We seek out experts. We seek out people who can fix us, who can do something to us. And I remember when I was doing my Reiki training, just this like distinction between thinking that you're doing something to someone and I have the power of my hands right now, or I'm maybe being a person who's helping person on the table receive something for themselves, but I'm just a conduit and they're the ones doing the work, and they have to be in that place of active receptivity to receive any benefit from it. And that's why in my opinion, a lot of science around alternative forms of healing, it gets so difficult because you need the belief, and the openness is like a huge component of your capacity to heal. It's like what we call the placebo effect is actually this huge deep thing, right? And really valuable thing. And I think we like divest ourselves of that power a lot. And that's something that also allows for a lot of this abuse to take place, the sexual abuse, because it's really easy. And I was in that position myself in my 20s of meeting people and looking for who's the healer, who's going to heal me, who's the best traditional shaman person, who's going to somehow have this thing to offer me. And that creates really weird dynamics. And I think it's also something that, if you are someone who does what we call holding space or facilitates in some way, to actively hand that power back as often as possible when you realize a person's trying to give you it, is a really powerful meditation. I think that's basically what you were saying, right, about your holotropic breathwork groups, is like telling people that actually no, the power is in you, not it's not in me. I'm not your healer doing something to you. I'm just helping you to heal yourself. I'm holding space for you to help yourself, and things like that. And then to maybe have, once we have more awareness around language, around the process of healing in our community, maybe then people who are actually a bit sociopathic and serial abusers of power will become a lot more obvious, because it'll be very out of alignment with the narrative or the discourse that we have around healing.
Absolutely. There's this thing that just kept coming up for me hearing you say all this about technology and just kind of how technology develops. Like, if you look at computers or even Gutenberg press, like, for a while it was a really select group of people producing books, and then it became more democratic, and less magical.
Mm.
Over time,
Mhm.
I think because of prohibition, we think these things are more magical, perhaps. Like,
Yeah.
obviously I think they're magical, but I think we need to
Mhm.
demystify that a bit. Like, obviously keep a little bit, but realize that this is a technology that we can use and people can learn how to use it. You don't need to get the approval of some old white men to get a PhD and then dig your head in for 20 years to be a
Exactly.
researcher. Like, you can do this stuff like after reading a bunch of books and maybe mentoring with a couple people, and you could do
Yep.
it at home with your friends. Like, how dangerous really is it to sit for somebody taking MDMA that just lays on their bed with their eyes closed listening
Exactly.
to some music? Like,
That's what I was gonna say. Like, it's just this idea that, I mean, obviously, there's certain harm reduction things you want to know, and there's certain, like, just generally how to be a good sitter stuff that you can learn from reading anything online or from being with other people in the experience, or just having someone sit for you. I think is a great way to learn, because you realize what's helpful and not helpful, and how little it has to do with the person who's sitting for you. Right? It's like the less they do, the better. Basically, it's not about you as the healer or as the sitter. That is, I think that's a really important point, because we're at this moment where we're training psychedelic therapists, and yet it's like these are a lot of the substances, have an origin in nature and have been used like without people getting PhDs for a long time. And really, it's a very human skill to know how to sit with someone through grief, or sit through someone through discomfort, or sit through some with someone while they are in their process, and that's something we can learn to do for each other. And I love the idea of having like a collective, a non-hierarchical collective of, intimate friends, community members who take turns sitting for each other. To me, that's the psychedelic future I want to see. I think what can be difficult about having those sorts of structures is that it takes a level of dedication from everyone involved. And that was something that maybe was just natural and implicit to many situations, like when we had organic communities. Like, I'm living with my village, we're all here together, so we're all invested in each other. There's a depth of connection and intimacy and involvement, and that was all pre-existing, so you had that to work with. And for the most part, I think most of us living in America anyway don't have that system, that like deep, tight knit community where we're going to equally be invested in time, and let's get together once a month, and this month will be mushrooms, and next month will be MDMA, and whoever feels the strongest affinity with that medicine is gonna and feels the most comfortable will step up and say, okay, I'll hold the space this month for this, or whatever it's gonna be. And I think that's something that is really shows the poverty of our society, that we don't have that. And I think it takes time to build that, but that's ultimately that what's going to lead us out of these structures of power and authority that just are inevitably going to be abused, regardless of what color or gender the person in charge is. So, I mean, there should be a diversity of gender and race in these positions, but ultimately I'd like if there weren't those positions of power at all. That would be the great ideal for me. So how do we take that power back?
one of my favorite, again, a man, unfortunately, one of my favorite permaculture
I
teachers is.
appreciate the self-awareness though.
I try. We're working on the show too to figure out gender and race diversity as best we can. It's complicated in the psychedelic world, but we're working on it. But this gentleman named Larry Santoyo is a permaculture teacher, longtime permaculture teacher. In fact, I think he's probably like number 3 most senior teacher in terms of like tenure of years teaching. He had this idea he presented when I was doing my training about forming kind of collectives. Dunbar's number, like this concept of
No.
like 100. So evolutionarily, like throughout history, it was like I'm going to get the number wrong, but it was in between 80 and 130 people would be like the max size for like a village, and like the optimal size for us in terms of relations, close relations. So like people you deal with
Yeah.
regularly. Um,
Mhm.
so perhaps you just form a collective of up to 100 people that can have different
Mm.
skill sets. It doesn't need to be formal. And that
Yeah.
way you have kind of this shared pool of all of your skills, including sitting and whatever else. Hopefully there's some chemists in there, wink, wink. Um, but, that kind of thing, I think could be really helpful for folks and cheap or free. It would probably
Yeah,
save you money in the long run in a lot of ways to put that thing together. And,
absolutely.
I
And
have this other
there's
concept around secret societies because people kind of share a little bit too much about psychedelic experiences that I think scare off the mainstream. Um,
hmm
and I'm sure you see this in like the 5-MeO world or sometimes the ayahuasca world. Like it's not that you're doing harm really. It's just that some of these stories aren't going to attract folks, or certain folks are going to maintain stigma for another 30 years after hearing a story. Um, but creating some sort of like undercover group where it's okay to really release these things. Like you keep a scientific front in the foreground, and you have your real stories with your close friends who are probably best to share that stuff with anyway, right? I don't know. That's one idea I've had. I don't know how that works, but
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like who's gonna when you have those really kind of intense stories anyway, that it's usually more traumatic to share it with people who are not sympathetic than
amen.
anyway. So you definitely want support for that. And then I think the wisdom, like the collective wisdom and the like emergent wisdom of the group and the different roles that people play. I mean, I saw that on that women's council weekend I went on as well, that without any sort of like planning or like leader, delegating responsibility, someone was just got inspired for the altar and built the most incredible altar, and someone else thought to bring like a certain herbal medicine along that would be supportive, and someone else was a drummer and brought their drum, and so, it just all happened. No one organized it, no one came up with an agenda, but everyone was encouraged to bring their strengths and their skills to this group, this collective. And what emerged was like this fantastic and really rich weekend that never would have happened if someone tried to control it or be in charge, because it was really just every person feeling empowered to show up with their strengths and their skills and to be who they are. And that's so powerful, and I think we've forgotten how to do that, and what that feels like in community, then to really to know your value in a group,
Mm.
to know your worth and how to be in contribution, which is so empowering.
I wonder if there's some sort of lesson we can learn from kind of Burning Man gift economy style thing, because often we want to
Mhm.
transactionalize this whole world, right? Like it costs $7,000 to get a session, something like that, or
Mhm.
however much it costs to go on a retreat somewhere. We're hosting retreats too, so like I'm not gonna say I'm perfect here, but perhaps there's a way to detransactionalize it and make it a gift economy. And I don't know how to do that, but I think there's something valuable there, and people feel more of value when they're giving.
Yeah,
Just one of the
absolutely.
reasons I'm doing this podcast is giving, and it's
Yeah,
free. I feel
and it
good when I'm
feels
giving
great.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's difficult under capitalism and difficult also under the model of who's the healer, and then now that's my full-time job, I'm the healer, and then, well, I need to survive, and is this gift economy gonna fully support me as a healer, right? But if there's more equal distribution, if no one's the healer, if there's a collective all bringing their gifts, that becomes a lot more feasible. Because then it's like, oh, I can sit for 1 or 2 days this month, or I can bring my talents for cooking to this weekend that my collective's putting together and make sure it's catered. And so there's lots of ways of starting to navigate outside of structures of power and structures of capitalism, which are very intimately intertwined.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool. So we've been going for about 52 minutes. I want to make sure we don't forget to mention anything here.
I think we've covered a lot of really good ground. I just feel like the question that I sit with a lot and I don't have answers to, but which I'd love if all the other amazing brains out there who cared about the stuff we're sitting with is, how do we create containers that are encouraging of, supportive of the deep vulnerable processes of self-reflection that undoing racism and patriarchy and other systems of oppression take. How do we create spaces where, I mean, I'm doing a course right now called The Human Ecology of Racism. And it's by this amazing person, Raquel Faithful. And really, what they're doing is holding space for a lot of us white folks to be in our process around how around this ecology of racism. And it's a really profound experience because there's space for vulnerability for us to acknowledge ways in which, as mostly very politically active and very well meaning white people who are even involved in anti racism movements, places where we've messed up, places where we've dehumanized or made snap judgments or overcompensated out of fear of being racist, which is dehumanizing, or done any number of things. And those subtleties are so important. And I think that gets glossed over a lot when we are first having conversations like about very destructive forces, whether it's serial rape or, really police brutality or against people of color. Like there's these huge issues, and then there's the like individually, how are we interacting with or reflecting these forces in our day-to-day lives? And how do we create containers that make it feel possible and encouraged and safe to do that self-reflective work and use psychedelics? That's my big question.
Mm.
Uh, how do we find places for the real work of social justice to take place in psychedelic communities? So that's where
Yeah.
I'm at.
And I think events like that patriarchy panel, using that as a model or hosting these little retreats, like you could just go away for a weekend. Doesn't have to cost much. It could even be in tents somewhere for free if you can make that happen. And just get together
Mm,
and really focus on these things. Like the energy goes where the attention goes. And it seems like there's a lot of attention and energy on this subject right now. And sober,
exactly.
thoughtful action, I think, is what we really need. And more people to the
And
table.
and non-sober thinking too.
True. True.
But no,
Absolutely.
exactly.
Yeah. I think like those microdosing for creativity studies could really be leveraged here. And actually, one thing I thought of last night, another permaculture analogy is next best use. So say something like you don't want to introduce too much waste into your system. Like what's the next
Mhm,
best use for something that appears like waste or trash or whatever? Maybe you could
mm,
recycle that plastic bottle and use it somewhere else. Maybe you could have that person in some sort of diminished capacity still contributing somehow. I don't know what that
mm,
looks like, but
mm.
we need a lot of people contributing.
Well, I like that because I don't what I don't like is disposability culture. I think
Mhm.
that's basically where I get a little bit worried about where a lot of these movements are going. Not because people shouldn't be called out when they're predatory, but because then where is the opportunity for, not that they should maintain all their privileges during that process either, but where's the opportunity for self-reflection, rehabilitation, and reintroduction back into the community? Because outside of the like maybe 1 to 4% of people who are sociopaths, I have no idea what to do with those people. But outside of those people, I really feel like most of us are want to do good, and when we are confronted and maybe collectively called out, sometimes it takes that, and to get to a level of self-awareness. But most of us, when it does finally hit us, maybe after the naming and shaming, maybe after the firing from the position, we maybe have a moment to go, fuck, like, what have I done? And how do I, what do I do with this? And I don't think we have much in place socially for that. And so we dispose of the person. And I feel like we could probably keep doing that until we have no one left because we live in a really messed up culture. And I think we've all hurt people and abused people in our lives without meaning to, on different levels of, physical, emotional abuse in relationships. I think we all have that capacity, and we all dip into that at times, and finding a way to, not ignore it, which we've been doing for a long time, but also to find a way to address it when it gets called out and have a process that restores in some way is going to be better for the collective as well. So that's another big question that I just feel like we haven't gotten there yet as a culture. And then I just also sometimes get scared that the moment's going to pass and we're not going to have gotten there. And then it's going to be back to business as usual. So deep thinking needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you coming on and contributing here. This has been very educational for me, and I hope for the rest of the community as well when they get the
Oh,
opportunity
thanks.
to listen. So, yeah. Do you have any websites you want to send people to?
Well, I've got a blog that is very not updated. But if you want to see some of my older writing, you can go to thedailytransmission.com, where I blog on sex, drugs, and consciousness. I'm actually working on a draft of what might be a book. So it's been kind of taking up most of my writing energy these days. You can also just follow me on Instagram as Britta Loved. That's just my name, Britta Love with a D at the end, and see what I'm up to out in the world. I really love connecting with anyone who wants to continue these conversations because they're some of the most dear conversations to my heart. So thank you so much, Joe, for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to continue this these important conversations.
Yeah, thanks again. And until next time.